Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's Sustainable Media Center Substack Live. Now, this week we are thrilled to welcome Richard Gingras, one of the most influential thinkers in modern journalism and a longtime architect of the open web. So, for more than a decade, Richard served as Google's global vice president for news, shaping how billions of people access information while also championing a healthier, more sustainable future for quality journalism. He now continues that work as a senior advisor and as a founding leader of the Center for News, Technology, and Innovation. So, across his career, Richard has been a consistent voice for press freedom, innovation, and the civic role of a trustworthy information ecosystem. And at a time when Gen Z, my generation, is really redefining how communities learn, connect, and participate in democracy, Richard's insights offers both historical grounding and a forward-looking roadmap. So we could not be more excited to have him join us for an intergenerational conversation about the future of news, technology, and youth empowerment in rebuilding our information ecosystem. So thank you so much for joining us, Richard.
No, I'm delighted to be here and delighted to have this conversation. And thank you for that very charming introduction. The only thing I will say is that it's not so much I know the answers as much as the fact that I've spent 5 decades in the space. And what I like to think is that over time, you simply develop a better and deeper understanding of the questions we should be asking ourselves. Because the answers, as you know, are myriad and complex. But always happy to have the conversation.
Absolutely. And while I know that, to your point, each question I'm going to ask has a deep complexity, I'm excited to jump in and to kind of start talking about, the open web and civic health as kind of the first topic. So start by telling us, how do you see the open web holding up today, and what parts of it feel most at risk?
It's a good question. It's also a big question. And I think I would start by saying we first should recognize, particularly from an American context, I've always thought of the open web in a sense as our First Amendment come to its full definition and fruition, which means, by the way, that it's filled with expression that's both noble and helpful, as well as heinous and problematic. In a sense, that is what we accept with free expression. And I think we should be equally troubled if we found that the open web was far more controlled than it is today. So what is that? I think with the web, we have more wheat than we've ever had before in the information environment, but we've also had more chaff. But I think to your point, it really kind of depends on how you want to assess it. I think the web is still hugely powerful, vital, and valued in the sense there's a massive amount of information there from governments, from organizations of all sorts that's hugely helpful to our society in different ways. Obviously, we're also confronted with the fact that there's a lot of noxious information on the web that does challenge our societies. And I think that's obviously a key objective that we all need to be thinking about. And I, gladly would get into there. I do think that, in a sense, the web also suffers from a tragedy of the commons in certain instances, not overall. And like when I look into the publishing context, the publishing industry, I look at the web sometimes and say, is that really how we would like that to evolve? And I'll use a very basic, almost mundane example of searching for a recipe today, via the web. What you're likely to get is dozens and dozens of recipes, and each site will gladly give you the history of the knife and the fork, or the history of grain and how it was processed before you get to the ingredients. It's a 2-mile long scroll because they want to make sure they can expose a bunch of ads to you. So we do have these challenges with the web today. Is how do we sort out the wheat from the chaff? How do we sort out those who have, I think, very good intent in providing the information they want to provide in a way that's respectful to the user, and those who are simply looking to make a few nickels and dimes off of the content that they're trying to push forward. So again, overall, I think the web has been a remarkable thing for our society, but it faces challenges. Uh,
Mhm.
some of those challenges, by the way, not to go on too long, is
Sure.
even by organizations who are trying to do the right thing, is do they have good experiences on the web? Uh,
Mhm.
that I think continues to be a problem that I think tends to stifle the engagement, success, and sustainability of many websites today. But I'm glad we have it.
Yeah, and I think that, you had mentioned how the web can be remarkable, and I completely agree with you. Um, I think one of its most remarkable features is its ability to engage people civically. So, from your perspective, what does a healthy open web look like from that civic point of view, and how would we know if we're moving towards it?
I think that's an area where there's a lot of tremendous opportunity going forward. Um, and I think this, in considering this, one needs to also consider the challenges, in a sense, that modern day communications has brought us. So, if I might just touch on that,
Hmm.
and I've written on this because I think often we kind of misunderstand the societal impact of advanced communications. One of the things I point out is that communications technology at every step along the way, starting with Gutenberg in the Bible, was and Gutenberg in the press, was that it's disruptive, right?
Hmm.
The initial users of Gutenberg's press was Martin Luther triggering the Reformation, right?
Hmm.
So there's always been disruption. When you move to radio, there was further disruption, further fragmentation, cable television, further fragmentation, and with the web as well. And so it is this core dynamic that I think makes it difficult for societies to self-govern,
Hmm.
right? I mean, and this was something, and I don't want to sound intellectual on this. I was not a terribly good student, but I've been doing a lot of reading since then. But if you go back to Plato, Plato predicted, he said, that democracies were the best, but the least worst form of government.
Yep.
Uh, but they're chaotic. And he said that democracies could fall victim to the freedoms they enable, meaning free
Hmm.
expression, right?
Hmm.
Because free expression, writ large, as we've seen, tends to fracture our societies, tends to break us apart. Um, One of the areas that I've looked closely at to get to your point is um, what has happened over the years, not just with the internet. I'm a big fan of the research of Robert Putnam.
Hmm.
Started his work in the 80s,
Yep.
specifically focused on Italy, as they had gone to provincial governments trying to find what was the correlation in a society between a province with an effective government versus not. And what
Hmm.
he found was the significant correlation was, are people in the community engaged with each other across the dimensions of that community? He wrote a great book called Bowling Alone. His point was that, like with the advent of television, people were watching the soccer matches on TV and not going on picnics, right? They were
Hmm.
spending 6 hours a day watching television and not joining a bowling league or a bridge club, right? They weren't engaging with each other in the real world. And obviously, the internet has made that even worse in that we can drop into virtual silos where we don't even have to go to the grocery store and
Hmm.
have everything ordered in. And so that dynamic of, can you have self-governing societies and civic engagement without bringing communities together? And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity today. So, we have the benefit of the internet having provided us with more civic information, but it is also, in its nature, made it more difficult for us to engage. And I think, again, that's the opportunity. As the other key thing I've been working on, I'm chair of a company called Village Media out of
Hmm.
Canada, which has been very successful commercially, but has also been just rethinking what can a local media entity be to a community.
Hmm.
We look at ourselves as building a digital operating system for a community that does feature news information, but it also features ways for the community to engage. It features engagement with local stakeholders to see how can we, as we put it, empower the community to address their own challenges.
Hmm.
So, a big part of what I think we should all trying to think of is to really step back and look at this with a rather clean slate and say, what do we need in today's digital world to make our societies work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the unfortunate challenge in disruptive times is that many people spend more time looking backwards. How did we get here? Why did we get here? Who do we blame? Than looking forward and say, how do we address civic engagement? How do we address rebuilding trust in news organizations that are providing fact-based information? How do we do that with younger generations who have obviously many, many more sources of content to go to? But we won't find those answers unless we ask ourselves the hard questions and start moving in that direction.
Mm-hmm. And next I want to kind of pivot the conversation, still talking about the civic role, but specifically of journalism and how it plays in our society. So when you look at our current information ecosystem, what gives you confidence that independent journalism can still play its civic role?
What gives me confidence is I feel that there are enough people out there who are willing to take on the challenge and drive this reinvention of what we do and how we do it. But I think it's necessary to drive that reinvention. I'm
Mm-hmm.
optimistic because I think there are enough people out there who recognize that when it comes to the world of journalism, that we need to rebuild trust in the
Mm-hmm.
work of journalists. And in saying that, by the way, I think it's important to point out the word journalism is a difficult word today.
Yeah.
People talk about the lack of trust in journalism. And one thing I always point out is journalism isn't monolithic.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all of the same, as we well know. A friend of mine, I was in Africa recently, and he pointed out, he says, the journalism community likes to think of what we do as being in the interest of the public good. But
Mm-hmm.
what we often fail to acknowledge is that so much of that, quotes, journalistic ecosystem is driven by political self-interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we shouldn't be surprised when we see that people don't trust journalism. I think the opportunity is to dig deeper and say, what are the causes of that trust? And how can I, as an individual journalist, or we as an individual news organization,
Mm-hmm.
understand why people are challenged and distrustful of our work such that we can earn and re-earn it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And often today I hear when we talk in the journalism community, people say we need more media literacy training. And I go, well, yeah, that's fine. But the
Mm-hmm.
truth is, we also need to step back and say, how do we do things differently? If people tell us that they sense that as journalists or news organizations we're arrogant in the way we convey things, then maybe we need to readdress that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we need to be more empathetic in our work? Do we need to be more thorough in our work to provide proper context? I'll give you an example, right? It's all too common in the world of news that, as the phrase goes, it bleeds, it leads, right? There was a cataclysmic event or a murder or some sort. But without the context, people are vulnerable to coming to the wrong conclusion that this suddenly is a major trend that has to be dealt with versus an isolated incident, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there too, we in the journalism community need to do a better job of our own efforts in our own work to engage with the community, our audiences, to earn and re-earn that trust every day.
And talking about audiences and audience relations, you have emphasized the importance of publishers owning, these audience relationships. So what models today feel closest to what you had hoped the industry would build?
I think and there are various models. There is success out there, which is very important, I think, to recognize. I think often in the news industry today, it's very much a tale of woe, disruption and failure,
Mm-hmm.
with pockets of success. But there are pockets of success, and where I see those pockets of success is largely due to some of the things I'm saying. Are those news organizations stepping back and doing, for instance, the market research to understand what kind of information needs does that market that I'm focusing on, what are they with the consumer? And I
Mm-hmm.
say different needs because if you're a national publication, that's different from if you're a vertical publication focused on, say, the environment or politics versus a
Mm-hmm.
local publication. But do you know their information needs today? not what you think they are or what they used to be, what they are today. You understand how you are perceived today. And if you look at that, where there's success, like the New York Times, they weren't an instant success. It really wasn't until roughly a decade ago, when they stepped back, they did their big innovation report internally, that they realized that there was a lot that they needed to do to achieve the success they've now achieved, right? Understanding their market, being incredibly sophisticated at driving subscription growth, right? Clearly a model of success. There are verticals that are doing very well. Political news verticals around the world, and emerging digital political verticals are doing very well. That model works, typically subscription based. Or some very focused environmental news organizations like grist.org do excellent work. So there are great models out there. And local, again, I would go back to examples like Village, which is completely advertiser supported, but based on, again, a rather thorough analysis of information needs, a thorough analysis of what merchants needed, for that matter, to drive their own success in the community and grow the economy to the community's benefit. So, there aren't simple answers, but there are answers, and we can get there, and that's what gives me great hope.
And taking a step back, what does newsroom independence mean to you in this era where public discourse is so polarized?
Well, there are several questions there: what independence means, and also how you deal with polarization.
Yes.
And they're rather separate. To me, if you want to have an independent free press, then you need a wide array of support. I've always been my career started in public broadcasting. One of the things I've learned in public broadcasting was be careful of relying on government support. I think that's very clear in what we've seen happen with public broadcasting. Be very careful about relying on philanthropic support. Foundations aren't typically comfortable with controversy. So beware of basing your sustainability on those pillars. You want diversity of support. And it's only through diversity of support that you can get true independence. It's one of the reasons why I like advertising. In the world of news, any publisher will tell you that at any point in time, something that you do in your news coverage is going to annoy an advertiser. And they'll even kind of get angry and walk away. However, if you've got 1,000 advertisers, then your business isn't going to collapse. And if your advertising actually works, the business will likely come back. So from an independence perspective, if you can't be independent if you're dependent on a few singular sources of income. So just that's the independence part. I think as far as polarization is concerned, again, individual publications will make their own decisions as how to approach this. My own view is, and this isn't a political statement, but if you have a divided society, if you have a highly polarized society, then one of your key objectives is, how do you build a fatter middle?
Yep.
How do you reach across the partisan silos of thought and expression? And so, that's what I would love to see, is more news organizations looking to appeal to a broader range of audience in the societies they serve. It sometimes is easy for many of them to drift into a partisan silo, as it were. We have our partisan news networks on cable in the United States. I can't say as I'm a big fan of any of them who are partisan, because it's not doing much to bring us together, right? And so how do we do that? And I think there's a lot of good thinking as to how one can do that. But we have to be intentional about it. We have to be aware of how people perceive us. We have to be aware of our language. And I've gone into a lot of this stuff in detail that probably isn't, that we can do in the time we have. But it gets to some of those points of context I mentioned. It gets to some of those points of, are we being humble versus arrogant in what we convey? Are we being careful not to overuse the word truth? Good journalism is about providing objective facts, and in my view, giving people the information they need to make their own decisions.
Yes.
And so be careful about being perceived as somehow you giving them the truth. Because honestly, we have all our own complex understanding of what the truth is on various elements of our society. So, how do we do that in a way that really kind of cuts across, the different perspectives and views of people, such that they can use that information to come to more thoughtful decisions about things. So again, I think there are many techniques, but we have to step back and focus on them. One of the things with village media, again, to come back to that, it's not necessarily about news. One of the things that we're doing in those communities is we've recently rolled out, in more than a dozen of them, a community interest network. This is like Reddit for local done with polish. And they're all moderated local topical discussions. You don't post into the void. You're joining a topic of common interest. I'm a woodworker. I like to do backcountry skiing. I'm interested in the local music scene, right? In fact, all of the topics are non-controversial. It's not an area to discuss politics. We don't have a topic called neighborhood watch where people can point out the person who scares them and want to call the police. Because that goes back to Putnam's work of how do we get people to engage on common interests that aren't controversial, such that we can meet people who are different from us. So I'm in that woodworking group, and there's someone who moved here from India, and there's an indigenous native person, and there's someone from, a red state and a blue state in different politics, but we all love woodworking. And through that commonality, can we develop a better understanding of each other and not simply drop into a silo of fear?
And for as one of the last topic areas that I wanted to touch upon, I wanted to discuss, the importance, kind of, I think it's been alluded to, of context and the need to refine editorial priorities. So you often highlight the importance of, context over sheer volume. So what does that look like in practice for a modern newsroom?
Well, I think there are several things there. I mean, context is, to me, is important across the board. Is making sure, because context is everything in news, right? Without that context, again, one can very incorrect conclusions. So that's not an either or. To me, that's a core principle that, if we want to, again, serve our societies properly and earn their trust, we should think about. I would say, actually, depending again on what your news organization, what market you're focusing on, I do think it's important to recognize that it's not just big J journalism that's important. Small J journalism is important. When I look at the community level, right, the wise objective is to focus on the broad community information needs. And yes, that is do good reporting on the city council, do good reporting on where you think there's nefarious behavior in, say, city contracts. But are you also covering who's fixing the potholes? Are you also covering what's going on in the community park this weekend? That new restaurant that opened, is it something that I can afford with my family of four? That kind of service journalism is of critical value because, among other things, it builds the shared reality of the community, right? We're all interested in getting the potholes fixed. We may have very different views on property taxes, but we're all interested in getting the potholes fixed. And if you look at it from a research and engagement perspective, that's what drives a huge amount of engagement. And one of the side benefits of that is that it exposes the audience to the serious accountability journalism that they otherwise might not have sought out. So it's of critical importance. And at the community level, by the way, that even includes mundane things like obituaries, right? So I think it's important. The way I think about it with work and local is, yes, you want to be doing the watchdog journalism, but you also want to be celebrating the community's hopes and dreams.
Absolutely. And one of the last major questions that I have for you, it's kind of twofold. One, I'm just very curious on what you're most excited about moving forward in your own work, but also more profoundly, we've talked about hope earlier in this conversation. What makes you the most hopeful moving forward into this age of AI, into this new digital ecosystem? Where are you deriving that hope from?
I think in all cases where I'm deriving hope is that as complex as the problems are, they're not absent solutions,
Hmm.
right? But we have to focus on them. And it's tough in times of disruption, right? Too often we spend time again looking for who to blame.
Hmm.
Um, and it's always easier to point to someone else rather than maybe what you're doing. And I
Hmm.
think we all have to step back and say, how do we individually, no matter what our role is, participate or engage in constructive steps forward? So
Hmm.
that's what gets me excited. What gets me particularly excited, again, the work of Village Media, where I chair the board, as
Hmm.
others like them. It's not, Village is a great company, but it's the concepts that are important, right? Can we, again, rethink the role of a local media entity in a community at
Hmm.
large, not just about news, but more than news? How do we make those communities work? What kind of digital operating systems do we need for a community in this day and age? So what makes me optimistic is that there are approaches that one can latch on to. And what makes me excited and enjoy my work is indeed trying to push those forward. How can we bring models like Village more prominently down into the United States, as an example? Um, Such that we can achieve the benefits of both informing the society, creating new methods for them to engage, and doing it in a fashion that's commercially sustainable.
Hmm. Absolutely. And with that response, I want to thank you, Richard, so much for joining us today, sharing such profound insights. And we also want to thank all the listeners out there for tuning into a very important conversation. So, as always, we look forward to chatting again with you all next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. I really appreciate it. Glad to do it further.